Thank you, Sarah, for having me here. I appreciate this. It's great to be on the panel of these distinguished, much more distinguished than I am, panelists. At CampusWatch, we try to catalog and maintain a database, as Stanley has mentioned, of the egregious politicization of Middle East studies. That's really all we do. We're a niche organization. We don't go outside of that particular field. For today's panel, rather than attempt to list a number of examples of violations, as Stanley has so capably laid out, of various provisions of the Title VI legislation, I thought it would be helpful if I simply gave you three broad categorizations of how, according to our research, we have found them in violation of that, and give you an idea of the kind of politicization that we find. The most common is anti-Israel bias. There's no doubt about that. The speakers who were brought in, the Title VI funds, and indeed in Middle East states across the board. An anti-Israel bias is something you can almost take for granted if you're going to find in a large research university. There are obviously individuals to whom that doesn't apply, but by and large, that's a driving ideological push that they do day in and day out. You can accomplish this in a number of ways. If I'm putting together a panel, I can have everybody in the panel, of course, who I know already is quite hostile to Israel, or perhaps stacked it 4-to-1 against the person who may be a little more neutral or probably not positive to Israel. And they do that regularly. Also, we've seen in the textbooks and the K-12 material that they turn out, very often you'll find, when you get into the modern period, efforts that are supported by the scholarship of these same departments that I think have a primary goal of delegitimizing the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. That's the principal goal. If you had to sum it all up, what do they hope to see occur in the coming years? It would be that. It would be the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state, and doing that by attacking them on moral grounds, claiming that Israel is an apartheid state. You've heard all those arguments before. That it goes against America's interest to support it, that it's, and as long as scholarship is not, I say scholarship in quotation marks, attempts to argue even that Jerusalem is not an ancient Hebrew city, that the ancient Hebrews had no more place there than the Phoenicians or the Canaanites or the Greeks or the Romans or any other of the thousands of people who have come through there over the millennia. So there are a lot of ways to accomplish that, and they know them, and they, I think, apply them pretty cleverly sometimes. And it's those who are not so overt who are usually the most dangerous. They're not spewing overt anti-Semitism. They're cloaking what they say in academic jargon, and doing it all of course, for the best possible reasons. Another would be apologias for terrorists. This can take a very crude form, which we find, and Tammy knows more about this than any of us. It can take a crude form of sort of vulgar anti-Semitism, hoping to kill IDF soldiers, or excusing terrorism as resistance, and therefore redefining it as not terrorism. But again, it can take more subtle forms, and sometimes these are more dangerous, I think, because they can kind of worm their way into the body politic, and it becomes a sort of acceptable, polite way to wink at terrorism. One way of doing that I think is analogous to the way the mainstream media can slant coverage, is simply not to mention it. Simply just leave it unresearched. It's not what the media says or say all the time. It's what they don't say. And in this case, research on terrorism exists, certainly. I never say that it doesn't. But given its prominence, and I flew up here from Atlanta yesterday, given its prominence, and I know it certainly affected me, it affects all of us if we stand there shoeless and beltless and walletless and everything else every time we fly anywhere. You think it might draw some attention, but it tends not to. Certainly not the way it would, I think, if it came from another report. That's my opinion on this. A third way they do this is to downplay the effects of radical Islam in the West. And these are overlapping categories, obviously, to some degree. And by that I mean, first and foremost, an effort to avoid the mention of Muslim terrorism, or of Islam as a root of it. Obviously, it doesn't go every time. It obviously doesn't apply to every Muslim. But whatever the event, when it occurs, when scholars are interviewed for the Times or the Post or NBC News or anything else, very frequently, that's the one thing that can't possibly be. You know, it's going to be right-wing terrorists who sound like me, you know, from down in Georgia, or it's going to be, I don't know, the Lutheran pastors associated for terrorism in the heartland or something. But it's never going to be, until a last resort, the possibility of Muslim terrorists. You saw this last year in the Boston bombing, I think, most obviously, in which anyone who hinted at the very beginning that this could be Islamicists carrying out a terrorist act was immediately attacked in the media, immediately labeled as a hater and bigoted and racist. This is done too through the liberal use of the word Islamophobia. Again, very cleverly using a term of clinical origin to describe someone as almost being mad, sick, mentally ill, for doing this, a phobia, coming right out of the psychiatric literature. At Berkeley, there was actually a Islamophobia research and documentation project, which has been for a very long time embedded with CARE, Organization of Islamic States, and others, Muslim Student Association, and various other outfits found in the Holy Land Foundation trial to be obviously related to Hamas and terrorists and various other entities. It's headed by Hatem Bazian, who is probably most infamous because after 9/11 he went out and announced it was time to launch an intifada in this country. And it's pretty typical. I mean, there's a certain boring element, I think, to a lot of this. It's kind of rote. You hear it every time, and if you deal with it constantly, nothing surprises you after a while. But repeated ad nauseum over the now more than a decade since then, this kind of effort to silence, to censor, to prevent anyone from speaking up, and speaking, especially in public, about the roots of this terrorism, does have its effect. And again, I think we see this. You see it in the kind of peculiar alliance between the academic left and the media left and the polite society left and rather radical elements, obviously, in the Muslim community, who would appear to have very little in common, but do have a common enemy. Bourgeois society, Israel, the Jews, and various others. And by throwing out quickly, just for discussion, Stanley has mentioned the way the Title VI funds go, in particular to this outreach effort K through 12. I wonder if we couldn't, in some ways, approach the use of federal funds on college campuses the same way the feds themselves approach the use of any federal monies in any entity, which is that we give you $1 and we own you. Basically, you take federal money and an entire panoply of rules and regulations and promulgations come down upon you immediately. I would argue that these Title VI funds, even if they aren't used directly, say to hire an assistant professor, and some of them may be used to hire them who's teaching Arabic, Farsi, and the like, couldn't be seen as allowing for the reallocation of resources within departments and programs. Take away $250,000 to $100,000 from your average department. That's a pretty good hit in the humanities department. It's not much for perhaps a law school or business school, but in your average history department or Middle East Studies department, that's a hell of a lot of money. And I would argue that allows them to reallocate resources in ways that they would otherwise not be able to do. And I throw that out simply as a topic for discussion.